to Good Grief, a podcast dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing grief with compassion and humor. I'm Nikki. I'm an end-of-life doula and a grief coach in Columbus, Ohio. And today I have a very special episode. I had a lovely chat with my new friend, Andrew, from Our Last Meal podcast. I was on Andrew's podcast a couple weeks ago and got to chat with him, and he is just an incredible human being. And he and I really came off as kindred spirits. We have the same passions on destigmatizing grief and both just feel so passionate about it that we had to start a podcast. So here we are. Thank you so much for tuning in. So sit back and enjoy my conversation with Andrew from Our Last Meal. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Good Grief. This week, I have a super special guest on our show. We have Andrew from Our Last Meal podcast. Andrew, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your show?
Sure. So you said it perfect, Andrew, Our Last Meal. It is a podcast on grief, loss, and food. And that's actually my tagline. And I always try to explain to people that it might seem kind of odd, but I think food and grief go hand in hand in that they are two very basic things that no matter who you meet on this earth, they will have some connection to one of those two things. Mm. And I have found myself in grieving the last couple of years on losing my grandparents, and from the podcast talking with people, a lot of people have a really close connection between a person that they care about they are grieving, mm-hmm. and a meal or a type of food that they either think about or they associate with them. So that was the premise that I started with, and it's led me to some really great conversations with some really good, interesting people.
Yeah, absolutely. I listened to several of your episodes, and it's everyone is different. So I love that so much about it. So was there an inciting incident or maybe even a specific loss that you had that spawned you to start this podcast? Or did you just think one day, this sounds like a neat idea?
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting. I always had, I say always, for the last several years, I've tried to be more mindful about thinking about bucket list items. Mm-hmm. And one of them that I had was, I want to start a podcast. I love listening to podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to far more podcasts than I do music.
Me too.
So well, it's because it's almost like a chance to learn something on the go. And I've learned as I've gotten older that this is me being boring, but I like to learn stuff, and I like stories. I love a story, mm-hmm. whether it's fiction, whether it's nonfiction. I love to be just entertained by actually going along on a journey with a narrator. Mm-hmm. So I'd had an idea that I wanted to do a podcast, but I didn't know what. I didn't know what the concept would be. 2 years ago, we lost my grandfather to cancer, and it was hard because he was in his mid-80s. Just up until the last year or two of his life, he'd always been just super energetic and just full of crap in the best possible way. He was a great man, and we lost him. The time from diagnosis to his passing was just a few months, but it was very slow but very fast at the same time, which may sound odd, but I don't know how else to explain it. So in the course of his passing and afterwards, I hadn't lost anybody since I was in high school. Was the last time I'd really lost somebody. So this is my first time losing somebody as an adult with more of an understanding of, I guess what that means. Yeah. And as part of my grieving process, one night I just had this idea like, well, that would be interesting to talk to people, because I don't feel like we talk about grief enough, mm-hmm. as a society. It's a very uncomfortable subject. And I thought, hey, this could be interesting to talk to people about it. And, very self-serving way too. It might help me kind of process some of it, because I haven't had a chance to comfortably talk about it. And there is something comforting about talking to one complete stranger versus sitting down with somebody, mm-hmm. and going through it. Yeah. So I had the idea. Actually, I bought the domain for the show, and then it didn't do anything for a couple months. I just kind of occasionally write down a thought or two, and then one night, like midnight, 1 a.m, I'm laying in bed, my wife's asleep, and I just got a wild hair up, to say, okay, I'm gonna do this. Yay. So I went to Amazon and I I bought a microphone and I didn't do any research. I just like, okay, that looks like that's a podcast microphone. It's got podcast in the description. Let me get it.
Yeah.
And I joined a bunch of subreddits and created some social media accounts and just said, I'm going to do this. I'm just going to throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the genesis for it.
That's awesome. See, I keep saying we're kindred spirits because that sounds so identical to my story. It was one of those like I thought about having a podcast for a long time. Like, nah, maybe one day. It's kind of like how I became a doula. I'm like, yeah, I'd like to do that, but I don't know. And then one night I'm like, screw it, I'm doing this.
Yeah.
So I went to Amazon, bought a microphone. I'm like, I already have a computer. Audacity's free. These
Yeah.
podcasting platforms, or most of them are free online. So why not?
That's the thing. It feels like there's going to be a crazy barrier to entry.
Mm-hmm.
I it's not really.
No, I
I
just had somebody ask me the other day. She's like, "Would you sit down with me for a couple hours and show me how to do a podcast?" I'm like, "Honey, it'll take me 10 minutes to explain this. Like, I
Yeah.
can't tell you how easy this is."
Yeah, I actually owe a friend of mine. She'd asked me like, I had an idea for a podcast and she told me about it. And it's a really good idea. I like it.
Awesome.
I need to just actually sit down and write out my steps to like, hey, this is what I do and maybe some
Hmm.
things I've learned. Um, I think the barrier to entry is incredibly low. The hard part is building an audience based
Yeah.
on what you're trying to put out there. And
Yeah.
you and I are in a similar space. I think it's
Yeah.
kind of hard to excite people. Like if you want to cry or if you want to feel really bad, my podcast, check it out. It's a lot of
I
grief,
know. I know.
but
And I like you as well. Like I just felt so passionate about that. We're not talking about grief. And
yeah.
I sit and like tell my I'll just talk my husband's ear off. The poor guy. I'm talking about like, yeah, this and oh my god, and this thing. And it's like, you know what? Why am I shouting him? I could yell it into my microphone, put it out in the world for the universe. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, here I am, and yeah, it's getting a listener show. I'm still, still getting my footing, but I've got a handful of very faithful listeners. And that, like you, this is a labor of love for me. I don't care if
Yeah.
I don't get 8 million downloads. I don't care. I just, if I help one person feel better, then I feel like my job's done.
That's exactly where I'm at. If I can, if, and I've had multiple people that I've had on the show who, the first person I ever spoke with, Christian, he told me things that it sounded like things he hadn't really said out loud. He
Mhm.
had lost his step grandfather and he told me something, and it's been almost a year now. So something to the effect of he didn't feel like he'd ever expressed how much he cared about him while he was alive.
Yeah.
And I think it helped him in a way getting to say it.
Yeah.
And there is, I think, a comfort in talking to a complete stranger and almost screaming into the void, which is kind of what this is. This is
Yeah.
really, it feels very self-fulfilling sometimes to do this, but I guess if nothing else, it's an interesting hobby.
Hmm.
But I have found like it is really, there's something so important about it. And I'm fumbling over my words and I know that, but it is hard to put into words. There's something so, incredibly motivating about it.
Hmm.
Having a chance to just connect with people because I don't really feel like we do that much. And
Yeah.
I don't know if we are afraid of it as a society, if we are not comfortable with it,
Hmm.
or if we just feel like it's almost like that middle school embarrassment of, well, I don't want to try because, I might
Yeah.
get rejected.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think a lot of it is just the way our culture views grief in general. Like
Yeah.
I think we're getting better. We don't look at it as a weakness, so to speak. I mean, I think back to like, the 1950s when even then it was never really considered a weakness, but men weren't supposed to cry at funerals.
Yeah.
You'd be there to pat your little wifey poo on the head and make sure
Yeah.
she's okay. But men weren't supposed to express their feelings. And even women, it's like, okay, well, you had this loss and you've had a week. You better be over it by now.
Yeah. It's like,
So,
put up the appearances.
mhm,
And I'll say even now,
yeah.
I like to think I'm a pretty open-minded guy. I think I'm in touch with my emotions. I think becoming a father helped me with that.
Hmm.
Even I've struggled expressing myself in grief.
Hmm.
I lost my grandmother just a few months ago. And this is after almost a year doing a podcast where I talk to people about grief. And I was a wreck trying to process,
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, my poor wife, she had to see me in the span of a year and a half, just about lose, both of my grandparents. And it wasn't easy, but I will
Yeah.
say I think this, doing the show and trying to have more conversations has opened me up to being able to process a
Mhm.
little bit better, but there's still a long way to go.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm forever grateful for my husband for a million reasons. And I always
Yeah.
thank him at the end of every episode of my podcast for just putting up with my BS. But he and I both suffered pretty massive losses in the same year. His mom died unexpectedly. And then 5 months later, my brother died unexpectedly.
Yeah.
And, those are both close and young. Like his mom was only she was 55, I think, when she passed. And like the fact that we had to learn how to grieve quickly,
Yeah.
because we didn't have that time. It wasn't somebody who was older. Not saying, it's not sad when somebody older dies, but you, it's
It's different.
more, yeah, it's different. And when it's unexpected, you don't have time to process the fact that, okay, this death will be coming. Even if they're not sick, when somebody's older, you're like, well, they're not going to be around forever. They might only be around another few years. When somebody's
Yeah.
younger and they die unexpectedly, you don't have time to even think about it. And then it's there and you have to start processing that grief.
Yeah.
And it's hard. So we both kind of like helped each other learn how to grieve in a way.
I mean, and that's, I'm sure for your relationship, I mean, that's things like things like that can they can pull the relationships apart, or they can also go the other way and really strengthen them, because
Mm-hmm.
it's that opportunity to be there for that person in a way that you can't really fully prepare for it.
Yeah.
I'll credit my wife too. I mean, she, in both of those, she was great, because I mean, she even acknowledged, I don't know what to say or to do,
Yeah.
but just the her presence and her willingness to, let me express myself
Mm-hmm.
and just listen to me talk, and just even just saying comforting things.
Yeah.
When my grandmother passed, I mean, it, this may sound cliche, but I mean, coming from her, it was very reassuring and very comforting. Was, you know, we're neither one of us are religious, but she did say, she's with your grandpa now,
Mm-hmm.
and just in that moment, I needed that, and
Yeah.
it helped.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I didn't know what to say when his brother called us. And I mean, his first call was, something's happened with mom. They took her away in an ambulance. And then 10 minutes later, he called to let us know she was gone.
Yeah,
And, of course, the first thing out of his mouth was, I'm so sorry to his brother because his brother was there. And I'm like, well, what about you? You just lost your mom. And, they got off the phone. I didn't know what to say. I'm like,
you're not
I
prepared for
mean,
it.
it was a grief for me too, because she was my mother-in-law and amazing woman. I met her a
Yeah,
few times and it was just like a shock and like, what happens? Like, what do I say? What do I do? But I mean, it comes natural. I actually had a whole podcast episode. One of my first ones was like what to say to somebody who's grieving and what not to say.
yeah.
Because there's so many things you could say that are just like, don't
I
say that.
But I'm glad you did that though, because I think some people default instead to nothing, to just say
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's different for everyone. And I'm a firm believer that everyone will grieve their own way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't I don't think that there is any necessarily right or wrong way to do it. I do
Nope.
think that there are healthier ways versus
Mhm.
others.
Absolutely.
Um, but I think sometimes, I mean, I found one of the best things you can do is, tell me about the person,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
I was just discussing that with somebody the other day about how a lot of people are afraid to broach the subject when somebody's lost someone, especially with somebody close. Like, I don't want to bring it up because I don't want to make them sad. It's like
Yeah.
they're not going to forget that that person died.
Yeah.
They're well aware that that person is no longer with them.
It's like,
And most of the time, like when my brother died, I was happy when people asked me about him.
yeah.
I was more than happy to share stories and get to talk about him a little bit because that helped me process my grief. And it also helped me just share his memory,
Yeah.
you know?
When you were on
So,
my show and you talked about him, and the anecdote you shared, that this brought me a sweet sadness is the best way I can think of to say
mhm.
it. Talking about, driving with your parents, and his urn.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's where when I heard it back when I was editing, I remember laughing, and like I had a tear in my eye, because it's
Yeah.
it's so beautiful, and it is you want to talk about those people.
Yeah.
I want to
Absolutely.
I want to tell people that my grandfather was a funny man. I still love being able to tell whenever I'm riding with my wife and I get an opportunity, how whenever my cousins and I would ride with him in his truck growing up, he would always be hunched over the wheel looking all around. He did heating and air, he owned properties. He would point out houses and buildings and say, I put an AC unit in that one, I put a new heater in that one.
Oh, wow.
I thought about buying that one. He'd look all around. He did inevitably, he'd always scoot off the road just a little bit, then jerk it back over,
Oh.
look over at us and say, keep your side on the road with the straightest face possible. You know,
Oh, that's funny.
I love getting to share those things because I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't make me think sad that necessarily that he's gone, but it just makes me happy I
No.
had him.
Yeah, exactly. It's so important to share your stories when you can.
Yeah.
It's a way of honoring them, much like, discussing food and sharing meals is a good way to honor somebody, like having a meal that they liked, which is what I love so much about your podcast.
Thank you.
I just loved hearing stories from other people say, oh, they liked this type of food and I can't eat this to this day without thinking about them and things like that. I love that so much.
Thank you. I went to visit my grandparents' house is now my aunt and uncle, they live there now. Because they were helping take care of my grandmother at the end. And,
Mhm.
I went up there 2 days ago to visit my aunt a little bit. And she had collected some of their things and I was able to grab my grandfather wore hats all my life. He's worn hats. He was bald like I am. I don't know if it was we used to joke that it was to keep him from hitting his head when he'd get into his truck or if it was to prevent sunburn. But he had a ton of these hats
Mhm.
and I was able to grab one of them. She let me kind of go through and I found one. It was a Three Stooges hat. I don't know where he got it from, but it just felt fitting because he was a silly man. I'm a silly
Oh,
man.
I love that.
And I actually got some of I've got them right beside of me. I got a couple of my grandmother's cookbooks too.
Oh,
Um,
wonderful.
and even I think this one may have been one that my grandfather used, but a printed out recipe. It's got a couple recipes on it, but one of them's for Brunswick stew, which is one of the things that he, was known for. But I have a couple of these cookbooks that belong to my grandmother. I think one of them may have been from like a family reunion type deal. The other one was from the church that she went to or her sister went
Mhm.
to, but they both have handwritten notes in there that she put in there about recipes that she liked and tried.
Oh.
There's a couple of handwritten recipe cards in there. And to have that means so much to me. And
Mhm.
even talking with my aunt, she talked about different foods that my grandmother would make. So it's even in that moment, it helped us to kind of bond and to kind of, you know, share a little bit, grieve a little bit,
Mhm.
just remember her.
Yeah. My niece got married last summer, and the gift my mom got for her wedding shower, she got this beautiful engraved recipe box that has like
Yeah.
her and her now husband's name and their wedding date and some other like little sayings. But she asked family members to write down their favorite recipes on a card that they could fit in the box. But my mom also went through and photocopied. She still has recipes that like her grandmother had handwritten out for things, all sorts of recipes she made, and so she photocopied them not just to have the recipe but so she could have her great great grandmother's handwriting,
Yeah.
which is and my mom has the originals and she'll probably pass them down to me at some point. She gave me copies too because I'm like, I want copies of that. I don't know if I'm a terrible cook, I don't like cooking, but I might try one someday.
Yeah.
But it was just like, what a thoughtful and beautiful gift. And of course, my niece was just like beside herself. She loved that so much.
Well, it's such a immediate, personal, intimate connection to somebody, right?
Hmm.
Maybe even somebody you never met, but his family, they're a part of your history.
Yeah.
So if you're making this recipe that they made, that they loved, it's almost like they cooked it for you. And
Yeah.
it's I don't know. I was going through the cookbook, yesterday trying to figure out what's the first thing I'm gonna make, out of it.
Hmm.
Um it's just there's just it's just even now I'm trying to fight back tearing up a little bit just because it's just a thought that I can make something that, my grandmother made,
Hmm.
and it just feel like I'm having a chance to be with her.
Yeah. My husband keeps talking about he really wants to make kruszczeki because that was something his grandmother and great grandmother made. They're Polish, very Polish
Okay.
family, and it's a type of bread basically. And I'm like, are you? That's like phyllo dough. And what little I know about baking is that crap is impossible to work with. Like that's what you used to make like baklava.
Oh,
Yeah,
baklava.
right. It's delicious. It's amazing, but good Lord, what a pain in the butt to make. I'm like, you sure you want to try this? And then he was telling me like that was like something his grandma used to do. And I was like, oh yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Cross your
It's
fingers, but go for it.
yeah, I love baklava, but yeah, phyllo dough is
Ugh.
incredibly intimidating. But yeah, I mean, just like that right, I can understand why you'd want to do that. I mean,
Mhm.
because for me, it's the thing I want to figure out is her cornbread. She made the most amazing cornbread.
Oh, I love cornbread.
Yeah, well,
Oh.
and she made hers. I was talking to Mon about this, and I told her how we each had our own favorite dish that she would make, and for me, it was the cornbread. That is the gold standard. That is the bar for me when it comes to cornbread, and nothing
Mm.
has ever topped it. I've had good cornbread, but nothing's ever topped that.
Hmm.
And what I like about it is it wasn't sweet. Hers was
Okay.
I don't like sweet cornbread.
There's
My
such thing as too sweet cornbread. I've had it.
Yeah. I don't like cake. I don't want cake when I'm eating cornbread. I like it
Sure.
more on the like salty, savory side.
Mm.
My aunt pointed out to me, is like, why she made it that way is because she was diabetic. And I know this, but she was diabetic for most of her life.
Hmm.
And I never put two and two together that her being diabetic meant that she was not going to make sweet cornbread, meant that I, 36 years old almost, cannot stand sweet cornbread now.
Interesting.
Yeah. I'd never thought about it, but it
Yeah.
made perfect sense.
I don't. I like my cornbread a little moist, but not too moist.
It's got to have some, it can be too dry.
I don't like it when you take like the muffins when you open them up and they just fall apart like
Oh, yeah,
crumble. I
no.
hate that. That's anyway. I grew up on terrible cornbread, so I live in Ohio. We don't have Southern cornbread up here. We've got Jiffy box mix, whatever that stuff.
Hey, in a pinch, though, there's nothing wrong with that.
No, no, not at all. I love my mother. She wasn't the best at making it.
But I grew up on I've thought about this before. I grew up on a lot of like boxed food too, just
Mm.
because, hey, three kids to feed,
Oh
you do what you
yeah.
got to do, stretch the dollars. And there's some of that stuff though that now my wife was laughing at me last night because I was telling her one of my favorite dishes my mom made growing up was treat casserole. And I am about to probably make so many people just shake their head and say, "Yep, I knew the South was like that." Treat is the alternative to spam, which,
Oh
but
yes.
yeah,
I've
it's
heard
if
of
you,
this. Hmm.
yeah, it's I don't think that anything else needs to be said about that. It's the alternative to spam. So
Yeah.
take from that what you will. But she would make a casserole with it, with that, potatoes, cheese, onion. I mean, and as I say it does not sound appetizing at all. But God, when I was a kid, the night that she made that, I was always excited because I knew I liked it because it was good. And so it doesn't have
You
to be
know,
fancy.
I had spam. I only just had spam for the first time like 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And I turned my nose up at it and I had, I'm like, this stuff's fine. What's the big
Yeah.
deal? It's great for backpacking. My husband and I did go camping and backpacking because it's meat that keeps, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to refrigerate it or freeze
Yeah.
it. No, it's mixed in with mac and cheese. Oh,
Oh yeah.
that's the bomb.
See, I keep a couple cans in the pantry just in case we ever lose power, for an extended period, just to have an option.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's I'm never like, man, I am craving spam, but God,
Right.
I can't lie. I grew up eating the treat, and maybe I don't know. There's a special place in my heart for it. It might be, it might be cholesterol, but there's a special place in my heart for it.
Right next to that blockage. Just kidding.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious, has your viewpoint or thought process on grief and grieving changed since you've done your podcast and interviewed people and spoken to like so many different types of people?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I want to feel like I'm a little more in tuned whenever somebody's going through that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to think I'm there. I want to think I'm a little more in tune for myself, but I also know that there's the theory part versus the practice part. So in theory, I feel like I understand kind of the grieving process a little bit better, and that talking about it can be helpful. But again, losing my grandmother just a few months ago, it was still in the moment in the practice, it was hard.
Yeah.
But I do think, as far as grieving, I think I'm a little more sensitive to it now and how important it is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think one of the most interesting things I've heard doing this was an episode several months ago with the Mashup Americans. They it's a really interesting podcast anyway. They talk about what it's like to be a hyphenated American in this country, and
Mm-hmm.
they did a series called Grief Collected.
Okay.
And as I was listening to that, one of the things that they found just from talking with experts on grief, and this is going to sound so simple and so obvious, but it's so impactful to me is that, grief is just an extension of love. It's an expression of love,
Yeah.
and to hear it put in words like that, it makes sense. And we know that that's what it is. But I think to be able to view it that way as you're going through it, the only reason that this hurts as much as it does is because I love that person as much as I did, and as much as I do, because that
Yep.
doesn't stop. And it doesn't make it, I can't say that it makes it better, but it does reframe it a bit in a way that I think is healthy, and that it is kind of reassuring.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that I grieve my grandparents, just means that I still love them,
Mm-hmm.
and that hasn't changed, even though that they're not here with us physically anymore. So it has helped in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've learned so much through my own grief processing, but
Yeah.
just in the last several years, as I studied to be a grief coach and my doula work and everything, I've learned so much about grief. And it's interesting how once I learn it, it's like, wait, I already know that. It's just I didn't know that I knew that,
Yeah.
like grief being love. You're like, once you learn that, you're like, oh yeah, of course it is. What? Yes, that makes perfect sense. And there's just so much about grief that I've learned in the last couple of years that I'm like, I feel like we all know this, but we just don't talk about it.
Yeah. It's a very uncomfortable thing, but
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of, positive in being a little more open about it.
Yes. Yeah. I'm hoping that I'm seeing just in my lifetime that grief is becoming more talked about to a
Yeah.
degree. There's still some stigma, and there always, there might always be. I don't know. I can't see the future, but it's nice to see a lot of these stigmas going away. And I hand it to the younger generations under me. Like they're handling things better than I feel like we did. And they're more open about things than we
I
were.
that's true. I'm a millennial, and for all the crap we've caught the last decade and a half or so, for all the industries we've killed and all that nonsense.
Stop
And
it.
well, and then all the stuff that, like, you see, like, the Zoomers now. There is so much I see from the younger generation. I'm like, okay, they are more open and more accepting. And I think progressively, I'm hoping, as a species, as we keep going, I hope we learn to do better constantly.
Yeah.
And
And it seems like we are. I'm Gen X, so I'm like, I'm that one stuck in the middle. We're ignored, and I'm fine with that. But
that's, you lay low.
but I also like, I feel like at least I don't know if this was just me or like my experience, but a lot of our generation, especially in the 80s, there was so much image involved. It felt like the 50s all over again. It was like you had to maintain a certain image, and that couldn't crack or falter, or you were weird and you were an outcast from that. And grief was just a big part of that. And
Yeah.
anyway.
So when you said something earlier about, like, in the 50s, like, oh, stiff upper lip, don't show emotion. Whatever you do, don't show emotion, because God
Yeah.
forbid. But
It's what would the neighbors think?
yeah, and I realize now, as I get older, what would the neighbors think? Who cares? Screw them.
Yeah. I,
I'm
yeah,
worried about my
exactly.
plot of land. You worry about yours.
Exactly. Yeah, and that was something that was hard for me to learn or relearn, at least, is not caring what other people think.
I'm still working on that.
I
Yeah.
know it's a hard one because you do. And the way I try to think about, like, for example, I was reading this article about this woman who I'm a bit of a minimalist, and she had this minimalist wardrobe thing, and she wore the same dress every single day.
Yeah.
It was a plain black dress, and she would just wear different scarves for like a month, and not a single person noticed that she was wearing the same thing every day.
It's almost liberating, right?
Yeah, and she was like, "Well, hell, I only need this one dress now."
Yeah.
And if you think about it, like, tell me what your coworker was wearing to work on Friday.
And that's a good point. You know,
Exactly. So we're all a little bit self-centered in that way. So not
yeah.
everybody's thinking about you. So you don't have to worry about what other people think because they're thinking about themselves.
It's a little bit, it's a little scary, and also very liberating to think about that nobody's really thinking about you as much as you think they are.
Exactly.
So, live your life, and just enjoy it. You want to wear
Exactly.
the same dress every day, just do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Change your underwear though.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good call. Just in it,
It's
it's
just good
in general.
advice in general.
Even if you don't think you need to, just go ahead.
just go ahead and do it
You know.
anyway. All right. Anyway. So that's all I have. Before I get to letting you talk about your stuff and where people can find you, I have a tradition at the end of every episode. I pull a card from the death deck, which is this massive deck of cards,
Yeah,
conversation starters around death and dying, and we'll both get a chance to answer it. So I'm going to shuffle them up.
sounds good.
I'll let you see. I usually do this. Oh, I'm going to throw some on the floor. I let people listen to me shuffle them, and I pick one at random, right out the middle, not looking. Okay. Shrine Shine. Name and explain one personal item that rightfully belongs in your post-mortem shrine.
Oh God. Huh.
I know, these are hard.
Yeah, that's a really hard one.
We can draw another one. I don't care.
I'm trying to think and it's kind of intimidating. Okay, think of one material item that could be representative of you.
I know, because there's so much. Like,
I'm looking around my office right now to see is there anything here that I would say, okay,
what would
that's
be the what? I know.
God, I'm gonna have an existential crisis. I think trying to think about this.
Well, and I'm just, like I said, I'm a bit of a minimalist. Like, physical
Yeah.
possessions don't have the draw to me. So, like, if I were to think of something I had to grab, if the house was burning down, it would just be my passport,
Yeah.
probably.
Well, and looking around, I'll say this, and this will be, if it's too on the nose, I'm sorry, but it's my answer, so I get to have it for anyone listening.
Yeah.
Um, there's a picture on my desk that I have facing me when I'm working. It's a picture of my wife and my daughter and I at Chuck E. Cheese last year, and I'm gonna try and say this and keep myself from falling apart. My wife and my daughter are everything to me. When I was younger, I wasn't sure if I'd ever have a family like this, and to know that I have them and that they mean so much to me. My wife is my best friend, and just this. My daughter I call her my best buddy, and yeah, they just mean everything to me. And the older I get, the more I appreciate the time I have with them and getting to be with them. I mean, and that's you know 10 years ago, fun Friday nights going out. Now it's put me on the couch with the two of them, put me in a restaurant, anywhere I am, as long as I'm with the two of them, that's it. That's my happy place. If there is a heaven and it gets to be personalized, I just get to be with them for eternity. You know. Um, but yeah, the two of them, that's give me that picture of the three of us.
There you go.
That's what I live for. That's what I believe in. That's what matters the most to me. So if you need to encapsulate my entire life into one thing, that.
I'm silent clapping for people listening on the podcast. That is a perfect answer. Thank you. There's no wrong answers to these. So I have to answer it too. And no idea. I was listening to you. I'm like, oh, I don't have anything that good. Honestly, it seems a little odd, but this flag that's hanging up behind me there.
Yeah.
So there's a giant fundraiser here in Columbus, Ohio it's called Pelotonia. If anybody wants to look that up, pelotonia.org. It's a grassroots fundraising program that goes on every single year, centered around a 3-day cycling event that I've participated in for 11 years now.
Yeah.
That raises money for the James Cancer Center, which is like the largest cancer research center right now, I think, in the US. I think it's become the largest in the US. And like, I personally have raised over $40,000 in that time period. It's my passion project. I do everything I can to raise tons of money every year for that. I mean, the program itself has raised over $200 million in its existence. So, and it's opened up a brand new immuno-oncology research center. It's a big deal. So that flag would probably have to be with me. So,
And I think that's an expression of how much you care about others. I mean, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
And as somebody who's lost a couple family members to cancer, thank you.
Yeah. I lost my godmother in 2008, and I lost the wife of a good friend 2 years ago. She was younger than I am. Died from colorectal cancer. So it affects everybody. I don't think I've ever met somebody that hasn't lost somebody to cancer. So
yeah, there's no differentiating.
No. Well, on that sad note, hey, thank you so much for being on my show. Take a minute, tell everybody where they can find you, and yeah.
Thank you so much. I Nikki, thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed this conversation. I know somebody might hear that you've talked to somebody about for 30 to 45 minutes about death and grief and enjoyed it and think you're crazy. Maybe I am. Um, I appreciate you being such a warm guest or a warm host. I appreciate the work you do having these conversations and in your work as a death doula too. The thought that you're keeping people from leaving this earth alone. Thank you. With that said, to kind of tell you a bit about myself, if you are interested in checking out my show, it's Our Last Meal on all the podcast platforms. Just search that, Our Last Meal, Loss, Grief, and Food. If you are interested, go to ourlastmeal.com. You can email me at ourlastmealpod@gmail.com or ourlastmealpod on pretty much all the social media channels. If you're interested in coming on and talking about grief, I would love to talk with you. And I would like to call out too that grief isn't just death. Grief can be a relationship that is ended. It could be a friendship that is ended. I've had people come on and talk about, losing their own sense of self from after a major life event. There's so many different kinds of grief.
Yes.
So if you just want to come talk, I'm not a therapist or anything, but I can be a pretty good listener. So I'd love to have you come on and talk. And I hope, if nothing else, if you get a chance to listen to it, I hope it is in some way helpful to you or to someone. So that's me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, please check it out. I've listened to several episodes on it. I'm following you now and I'm picking up every new episode I can. So thank you.
Thank you.
I do love your show. And thank you for what you do, because you're helping people share their stories as well. And as we discussed, just sharing a story is huge sometimes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
All right. Bye.
Another huge thank you to Andrew for being on my show this week. I will put the links to all his stuff in the description. Please go check him out at Our Last Meal Podcast. I was actually a guest on his show, so we did a little swappy poo there. But don't just check it out for me, please. I feel like if you enjoy my show, you would really enjoy his. It's wonderful what he's doing and all the stories I've got to hear so far on his show. So please go check that out. If you'd like to see the video of our conversation, you can check that out at patreon.com/Nikki the Death Doula and get yourself a little subscription there. And you can watch our video and other videos and read all sorts of great things I post 2 to 3 times a week. You also get early access to this podcast without the ads. What? So please go check that out. All right, thank you so much for tuning in. Have a wonderful week. And remember, your grief is yours. Your feelings are valid. Grief doesn't always have to suck. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening today. It really helps the algorithm so more people can find me. But if you'd like to find me elsewhere, I'm at NikkiTheDeathDoula.com. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram at Nikki the Death Doula. Please feel free to reach out to me there. And if you'd like to support me on Patreon, you can find me at patreon.com/Nikki the Death Doula. As always, all the money I receive through my Patreon goes into a fund so that I can provide pro bono work to those who cannot afford my services. And you'll also get access to bonus content and maybe even a shout out here on the podcast. Scripts, editing, sound design, production, literally everything is done by me, myself, just me, except for the music. The music is Cheery Monday by Kevin MacLeod, and you can find license information at filmmusic.io/standard-license. And as always, a special shout out to my best friend and husband for continuing to support me along the way.